As promised, we start the next panel at 10:35 sharp. The next panel is entitled Carving the Present Out of the Past, Histories and Their Publics. I'm going to be the chair of it. My name is Chirot Zoltan, and I teach in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. The panelists range across disciplines, and I suspect the great divide this conference is between disciplines. Anyway, the panelists are David Brandenberger, Department of History, University of Richmond, whose paper is on rewriting history in Putin's Russia. Mark Kramer, director of the Cold War Studies program at Harvard, and his papers on the perils of historical forgetting and whitewashing, the former USSR and the Soviet bloc in comparative perspective. Jan Werner Müller, of the Department of Politics, Princeton. His paper is Germany's Two Processes of Coming to Terms with the Past, Failures After All. And Bogdan Jakob of the Department of History, Central European University, and Secretary of the Scientific Council of the Institute for the Investigation of Communist Crimes and the Memory of Romanian Exile in Bucharest. And his paper is The Romanian Communist Past and the Entrapment of Polemics. It seems to me this panel very much continues the discussion from yesterday, and as I was thinking about it, I had trouble understanding precisely the logic of the division, but that seems to me is a good thing. So we'll proceed as follows. Every panelist will have exactly 17 and a half minutes, which will be enforced very carefully down to the last second. And then I'll say a few things, and then we'll open up to discussion. And let's move in accordance with how the papers are listed in the program. So, and I won't intervene to introduce again. So, in order to move things, David Brandenberg.
So, I'd like to thank the Romanian Cultural Institute, Wilson Center, University of Maryland, and Georgetown for putting this on. This is a terrifically tight program, and the volume promises to be actually exciting, I think. So the first dean of Soviet history, Mikhail Pokrovsky, is remembered for the formula that history is politics projected into the past. And while party authorities officially rejected Pokrovsky's views in 1936, his maxim nevertheless explains, probably in hindsight, the USSR's preference for a single official historical line from the 1930s onward, perhaps from the 20s onward, but certainly from the 30s onward, something that was supported not only by Soviet academia and the censor, but official mass culture, public institution, and public educational institutes. More? All right, more. So not only Soviet academia and the censor, but official mass culture, public educational institutions, and state textbook publishing. Indeed, it wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 that society's traditional reliance on an official line and a handful of prescribed textbooks gave way to a much looser system within which a variety of ideologically diverse textbooks could vie with one another within a newly competitive public schools textbook market. The curricular diversity of this new world is illustrated by the fact that in recent years, some 100 different textbooks have enjoyed official approval from the Ministry of Education and Science for classroom use. But as the heterogeneity of the 1990s has given way in the past decade to consolidationist tendencies under Putin and now Medvedev, talk has again turned to the reestablishment of a single official account of the Russo-Soviet past in order to foster a broadly felt sense of patriotism, especially on the mass level. We're really talking about mass society, mass culture, mass education, rather than the higher education or the more demanding reading public, I guess. Notable in this regard has been controversies surrounding a new two-part teacher's manual by Filipov called The History of Russia and a two-part textbook for 11th grade high schools by a guy, one of his collaborators, Danilov, which is really derived from this teacher's manual. This paper examines the circumstances under which these texts emerged and the extent to which they can be considered to represent a new official line on the past. It also connects these developments to another series of separate, but I would argue, connected events surrounding the launch of the Presidential Commission to counter attempts to falsify history at the expense of Russian interests, which is the official title, in order to ultimately, I hope to draw this all together, in order to ultimately reassess the rewriting of history in Putin's Russia to the extent to which this is possible in a more cosmopolitan society than the Soviet predecessor. So the emergence of the Filipov text and its auxiliary materials is best viewed within the context of other coordinated efforts in the past 10 years to develop a usable past to represent the Soviets, the country's Soviet heritage. Putin first spoke about the need for a new sense of historical perspective shortly after coming to power, connecting the issue to the broader imperative of a national idea to unify the country's fractious political system. I should say that national idea is something that dates back to 1997, to the aftermath of Yeltsin's almost disastrous presidential re-election campaign. And in the aftermath, there was a decision made to try and look for a national identity already under Yeltsin. It didn't go very far, and Putin revives the idea in 2000. In the wake of this announcement, a hodgepodge of deferential gestures to the Soviet past made headlines: the revival of the Red Army battle flag, a sanitized version of the Stalin national anthem, the return of a bust of Dzerzhinsky to the militia headquarters in downtown Moscow, extensive state support and airtime for mass culture's renovation, rehabilitation, or normalization of the Soviet experience, and so on. Perhaps most notorious amongst all of this nostalgia has been Putin's own announcement in his April 2005 State of the State address to the Federation Council that, quote, the collapse of the USSR was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Now, efforts to promote a more systematic reading of the usable past in public schools date to about 2002, when then Prime Minister and now oppositionist Kasyanov instructed the Ministry of Education and Science to solicit bids for a new patriotic textbook. When nothing came of the 2002 competition, there were several more closed competitions run by the presidential administration, and it's in the context of one of these later competitions in 2006 that Filipov and a group of collaborators who come from a research institute connected with the Kremlin first draw the attention of the Russian press. Filipov's text for teachers, it's a teacher's manual, not really a history textbook, but a teacher's manual, is published for the first time in 2007, and it's still in print. It's gone through several changes and a change of title. But this eventual text and its auxiliary materials, it gives birth to a whole set of materials for the classroom, including a flagship history textbook for 11th grade, display many of the modern production values of this new post-Soviet contemporary Russian textbook market. Their shortcomings have received a huge amount of treatment in the Russian press. Particularly, and probably I'd say 80 to 90% of the criticism in the press is focused on the book's tendency to rehabilitate Stalin as a political visionary. I guess perhaps more troubling to me, and this where I'll put the stress on in this topic, in this talk, is the text's broader selectivity in regard to the usable past from 1945 through the early 2000s. Post-war events as important as the civil war in western Ukraine after the war, the retrenching of collective agriculture after the war, and the anti-cosmopolitan campaign are treated very carelessly in this textbook. Major international developments are also given highly idiosyncratic readings, whether concerning the United States' loss of the Korean War, the Warsaw Pact suppression of the 1956 Hungarian uprising, or the USSR's victory during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Broader themes in post-war domestic history are also narrated in highly partisan terms, such as the role of the Russian people, the Russian ethnicity, in the development of the former republics. Similar biases mar the discussion of international dynamics surrounding the Cold War, the standoff with China, and relations with a non-aligned world. I should say that Eastern Europe really merits only a footnote in this textbook. It enjoys no historical agency whatsoever. Such selectivity and partisanship is disappointing, both in terms of the specific position that Filipov adopts and because his choices really run counter to the commitment made even in the book's own foreword, providing, at least promising to provide for a much more broader factual narrative and an ongoing account of big historiographical debates. In fact, for a book that's published initially in 2007 and is still in print, this text makes almost no mention of the archival revelations since 1991. In many senses, it's a defrosted and remixed version of what was in circulation in the late 1980s as far as cutting-edge history goes. Officially, the Filipov text and its auxiliary materials are billed as a means of cultivating a mass sense of patriotism. Specifically within the public schools. Content analysis, though, I think reveals that the text's ideological objectives are decidedly different than emphasizing a patriotic agenda. Instead of emphasizing traditional grassroots community-based patriotism, the text focuses on state power, self-determination, and the construction of a political command and control system. This is most visible in the book's final chapter, which hails Putin's formation of a successful administrative team and his defeat of opposing forces, details which suggest an etatist ideological vision imploded around the exercise of centralized, hierarchically organized political power, the so-called vertical vlasti, rather than a wider sense of popular sovereignty or loyalty to country or community. This impression is confirmed by the structure and periodization of the rest of the book. Ignoring Soviet historiographical traditions that mapped the history of the USSR into Marxist stages of development, the USSR during the First Five-Year Plan, new stages in the struggle for communism, and so on, Filipov has also broken from post-Soviet historiographical traditions, which break the post-war years into cultural periods, that is, the thaw, stagnation, glasnost, perestroika, and so on and so forth. Instead, Filipov emphasizes the great men of history periodization, which organizes history around a highly personalized sense of political power. Although this focus on personality is precisely the sort of thing that we would expect from a non-specialist like Filipov, it appears as if this schema actually emanates from higher instances, specifically within the presidential administration itself, probably Surkov. Journalist Anna Kachurovskaya, for instance, quotes unnamed sources as saying that not only was the Filipov text sponsored by the presidential administration, but its authors received explicit instructions on how to craft their narrative. It should go approximately like this, Filipov was apparently told with his collaborators. Quote, Stalin was good. He established a power hierarchy, although he didn't establish private property. Khrushchev was bad because he weakened the power hierarchy. Brezhnev was good for the same reasons as Stalin. Gorbachev and Yeltsin were bad because they collapsed the country, although Yeltsin did allow for the establishment of private property. Putin is the best state manager. He strengthened the power hierarchy and strengthened private property. End quote. All right, so those were apparently the instructions received by Filipov, according to journalist Kachurovskaya. At first glance, this is almost a laughably simplistic approach to historical analysis. However, if you think about it a little bit more carefully, this sort of good-bad set of binaries is precisely the set of instructions that Stalin and Zhdanov gave to textbook editors during the 1930s. Moreover, it displays the same sort of unvarnished, folksy wisdom that Putin is known to indulge in when speaking off the cuff. Ultimately, then, the version of the usable past promoted by this Filipov text really serves the interests of the political command structure, first and foremost. This conservative vision of the historical process holds that nothing is more important than the establishment and maintenance of state power and political hierarchy, inasmuch as these factors, and only these factors, can guarantee national security and domestic stability. Political leaders are evaluated almost exclusively according to their record of defending state interests from foreign and domestic forces that challenge specifically Russian sovereignty, its executive power, or its political centralization. More liberal governing strategies and paradigms are held to result only in hardship, frustration, and tragedy, as illustrated by the historical experience of the Khrushchev, Gorbachev, and especially Yeltsin periods. Patriotism, too, is slaved to this sense of loyalty to a strong centralized state based on the etatist belief that the state is better equipped to safeguard national interests than grassroots political parties, social movements, civic organizations, civil society, or democracy itself. So I'd argue ultimately that this is an etatist rather than a patriotic line. And I think that this can be connected, though maybe it's hard to depict some of the causal links. It can be connected, nevertheless, to the agency standing behind the much maligned Presidential Commission to counter attempts to falsify history at the expense of Russian interests. This is a new commission formed in 2009, a blue ribbon panel composed of approximately 30 people, three-quarters of whom are high-ranking bureaucrats, and then the rest are Duma deputies, a couple of professional historians, and a couple of professional spies. The commission is tasked with identifying, investigating, and refuting damaging distortions to the Russian historical record, at least nominally, both domestically and abroad. At least as controversial as the Filipov text, when the Filipov text first emerged, the commission has been fiercely criticized in the Russian media for what critics fear would be its advocacy of censorship and blacklist. And I should say this criticism is really broad. We're not just talking about Novaya Gazeta or the opposition papers. Opposition is really quite broad-based, or at least criticism has been very broad-based since 2009, since the unveiling of this committee. Such fears, though, of censorship and blacklists appeared to be justified, at least they appeared to be justified back in 2009 and 2010, when the Commission's first two public sessions focused on public school history textbooks and the USSR's heroic role in World War II. Truth be told, however, these hearings in retrospect appear to have been done more or less for show, and resulted in virtually nothing of consequence on an institutional level, at least. The third meeting, which happened only just this past September, deserves a little bit more consideration, however. Because instead of focusing on sort of flamboyant speechifying and a big public message for the nightly news, Narishkin, the board's chair and head of Medvedev's presidential administration, shared the podium with Artizov, the new head of Rosarchiv, where both of them spoke in favor of greater archival openness as a means of resolving historical controversies damaging Russia's reputation both at home and abroad. So this would seem to be a rebuff to critics who feared that the commission would serve as a censor, and this is why it's worth considering. Artizov, head of Rosarchiv, noted that his agency had participated since 2005 in the publication of some 250 volumes of archival documents, and he particularly drew attention in this speech only a couple of months ago to two recent collections that have been done in collaboration with Rosarchiv, that specifically being a big collection on the 1932-33 terror famine and the 1940 massacre of Polish officers at Katyn. It's worth considering these two collections in some detail here because Artizov offers them as prototypes for the Commission's future work. The first book, The Famine in the USSR, 1930 to 1934, is a glossy, full-color anthology of archival documents on the terror famine, 500 pages long, released in 2009 in parallel with an electronic edition in English, which is still available on the World Wide Web. At first glance, it's a disarmingly gorgeous volume. Very expensive, small print run, but just a beautiful piece of full-color representation of the documents themselves. On second glance, however, it's so gorgeous that one begins to wonder who it was aimed for. That is, it doesn't seem like a typical publication aimed at professional audiences. It's a little bit too showy, and when you actually look at the table of contents, it turns out to be fairly selective. The suspicion is confirmed about its selectivity by analysis of the collection's contents, which appear to be designed to explicitly refute claims of Ukrainian exceptionalism during the terror famine and any notion of premeditated genocide between 1932 and 1933. To do this, and it doesn't do this through authorial notes or editorial interventions, the collection, in aggregate, the collection provides documents which stress the breadth of the famine's impact across the USSR outside of Ukrainian borders, the coercive but non-murderous intent of the period's punitive policies, and the complicity of Ukrainian and Kazakh Communist Party officials in the famine's development in these non-Russian republics. So in aggregate, this seems to be a real strike against Yushchenko's movement between 2005 and, of course, 2009 when this edition emerged to reframe the historical memory of the terror famine. Artizov's second prototype for this commission's future work consists of a more narrow swath of declassified documents on the 1940 Katyn massacres, which appeared on Rosarchiv's website right after Putin made the historic admission in Poland of Soviet responsibility for the massacres. And this happened really earlier this year only. These documents confirm the complicity of Soviet officials in the massacres. That said, they also support the official position that this tragedy was the result of high officials' mismal or nonfeasance, that is, their abuse of power, rather than any officially sanctioned act of genocide. The collection also exposes the attempts of party apparatchiks under Khrushchev to obscure the historical record by sealing these documents in the Osoboye Papki, and by sealing the record, this conveniently supports the USSR's half-century cover-up of the crime and reinforces the notion that culpability within Soviet officialdom rests with renegades rather than with the state itself. Seen in this light, it's easy to understand why Artizov considers the work here to be absolutely key to the Commission's future efforts to rebuff historical revisionism. Far more valuable than the rhetorical grandstanding and photo opportunities of the Commission's public sessions, these materials allow Russia to seize the initiative in two bitter international disputes and defend key state priorities, specifically derailing charges of genocide within the terror famine or the Katyn massacres, which might result in reparations in international court amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars. So let me see if I can take a step back here for a moment out of time interest to reframe aspects of what is happening. On one hand, the worst fears associated with the Filipov text and the Commission on Historical Falsification have not come to pass. That is, the Filipov text has never become a monopolist text. It has never pushed out other competitors within the textbook market since 2007. On the other, in the same line, the Commission on Falsification has not assumed the role as censor, nor has it assumed the role of compiling blacklists that appear to have any real substantial role. So one can think about maybe a lack of institutional follow-through, at least from on the first glance, with these possibilities of using stronger state administrative functional abilities to dominate the public sphere or to recast historical memory. However, I think that looking back to Soviet analogies of within which to run indoctrination and informational control may be the wrong place to look if we're trying to understand what's going on. The best solution to this puzzle, I think, is to understand that key members of the presidential administration understand that heavy-handed measures, such as those old Soviet institutional frameworks, are simply not necessary in 2010. That is to say, that although the Filipov and Danilov texts have never assumed a monopolist position, they have achieved hegemonic quality even without dominating bookstore shelves or school library shelves. These texts have given a clear signal, a clear articulate signal to educators and mass market authors about what they consider to be the correct version of the usable past. They've also signaled the state support that is to be awarded for following this template and is to be denied for texts and projects that do not follow this template, something which is already visible in the Ministry of Education and Science's list of endorsed textbooks and the homogeneity of Filipov competitors. We can also see this in the way that the Commission to Fight Historical Falsification is working. Again, a complex series of signals are being sent to major institutions in post-Soviet society, indicating what is going to be acceptable and what is not going to be acceptable in the aftermath of the Putin-Medvedev project. These signals have driven a wide variety of state and non-governmental organizations to review what sorts of activities might incur the wrath of the Commission and its associated agencies, and to correct their publication plans accordingly. Ultimately, the publicity surrounding the Commission's semi-annual public sessions and its politicized publications are going to discourage future work on sensitive topics relating to international security, diplomatic ties, or state interests abroad. And so in summary, the end result is the creation of a de facto rather than de jure official line on history, flanked by an institution which is at least theoretically capable of identifying and silencing incompatible views. It's a remarkably subtle strategy for influencing the way history is being written in Putin's Russia, and it's transforming the Soviet experience into a usable past by distinctly non-Soviet means. Thank you.
Mark Kramer.
Excuse me. I'd like to thank the Romanian Cultural Institute for what's been a very interesting conference yesterday. Yesterday afternoon session had a presentation on the Tismaneanu Commission's report, and then subsequently Vladimir Tismaneanu actually got a chance to respond to that, which reminded me of the scene at the start of Annie Hall where Woody Allen gets into a dispute as he's standing in line to get into a film over Marshall McLuhan with another film goer, and suddenly Marshall McLuhan appears and Woody Allen is able to invoke him on his behalf and then looks at the camera and says, "Don't you wish life were like that?" But yesterday it was. What I'm going to be talking about here is, and again, this is the theme of the conference, but I emphasize it mainly because it's different from historiography. I'm going to be talking about popular memory of history. Historiography ultimately is resolved among scholars, competing interpretations, evidence that's amassed, the like. It's not to say that there's ever any set historiography, but certainly some historical interpretations are regarded as better than others. Popular memory is quite a different matter. It's shaped by political, consciously or unconsciously, shaped by what de facto is a political competition to define it. There will be influential elites in many cases who will seek to entrench their memories, their conception of what popular memory should be. And in the cases we're looking at here, these are countries that suffered extremely unpleasant episodes in their history. Some of these influential elites are the very ones who perpetrated some of those atrocities. And that means that in the transitional period or in the democratization period or the post-communist period in the case of countries I'll be looking at, that they try to airbrush out their own roles, which means substantial portions of what occurred, or at least to de-emphasize them. Now, in all popular memory, as again, there are numerous books that have been done on this topic, but there is a degree of deliberate forgetting that if you just harp on what you did that was bad, then that itself creates a distorted sense of history. For example, if you look at U.S. history, you could find many atrocious things that occurred, be it the enslavement of blacks or the extremely destructive campaigns against American Indians, or more recent excesses, the rounding up of Japanese Americans at the start of the Second World War, other things of that sort. But if you focus only on those, as some historians have, in what are popular, they're writing popular histories, then that itself creates a distortion. So what I would argue, though, is the extent to which popular memory diverges from historiography, at least when it comes to facing up to some of these atrocities in the past, these atrocious episodes in the past, it creates dangers, especially if you are a society that ideally is going to move to a democracy. In the paper, I'm not going to dwell on this here, but in the paper I do try to set this into comparative perspective by looking at the experiences of 5 well-established democracies, Germany, France, Austria, Japan, and the United States, to look at the problems that they have had in coming to terms with extremely unpleasant episodes. You can think, for example, of Japan, where today there, in fact, is a gathering at Hiroshima about nuclear weapons. That's the episode that in Japanese popular memory is enshrined as probably the single defining moment of the war. What's left out of that is the abominable behavior of Japanese troops in East Asia prior, in China, in Manchuria, in Korea, elsewhere. That is something that has caused great tension in Japan's relations with other countries, with China, South Korea, etc. So again, democracies have had great problems in coming to terms with these issues in popular memory. Historiography is quite a different matter. Most of these, there are Japanese historians, in fact, who have done very good work on the atrocities committed by Japanese troops. But in popular memory, that tends to get airbrushed out. Looking at former communist countries, here, in the paper, I look at the experiences of Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. And I don't have time to dwell at length on any of these, so let me just give a very quick overview of what is covered here. And looking at the case of Poland, unlike, say, in East Germany or Czechoslovakia, where the communist regimes collapsed relatively quickly, in Poland, there was quite a, and Andrzej Paczkowski will be discussing this in greater depth this afternoon, but there was quite a prolonged transition, which started with even before roundtable talks, but particularly roundtable talks, and then the partly free elections that were held in June of 1989. And that all of those led to the formation of a solidarity-led government in August 1989. The important point to be emphasized here, though, is that transition gave certain elites opportunities to try to do things, to shape the post-communist transition. That, in turn, has affected popular memory of this period. It also meant, though, because Wojciech Jaruzelski and Czesław Kiszczak were allowed to stay on in their positions, Jaruzelski as president, Kiszczak as Minister of Internal Affairs, they had the opportunity to allow destruction of documents. Some of that, there's no question that destruction occurred. The scale of it tended to get exaggerated, but that too has had quite a negative effect on popular memory. That this period, the period of shifting to a democracy in Poland, is now often looked back on by many Poles as a conspiracy, as an effort by elites to entrench their own interest, to translate their political power into economic holdings and the like. I don't have time to say more about this, but we'll be glad to come back to it. In addition to that aspect of popular memory and about, again, I think the failure to think it through more thoroughly has had a pernicious effect. There are two individuals in particular who are on opposing sides in 1980-81 who have been the subject of a good deal of controversy in Poland. One of them is Jaruzelski, the other is Lech Walesa. Jaruzelski has put forth the notion in his memoirs and many other places that he, in December 1981, was pursuing the lesser of two evils, that is, imposing martial law to avoid a Soviet invasion. The majority of Poles actually support Jaruzelski in that view, if you go by public opinion polling. The actual historiography shows that, to an extent, Jaruzelski's claims have merit. He was acting under excruciating pressure. What he leaves out of that narrative, though, is that in the final days before martial law, he was actually urging the Soviet Union to send troops to Poland, that he, under extreme nervous exhaustion, essentially a nervous breakdown, Jaruzelski, who up until that time had discouraged the Soviet Union from sending in forces, which it had offered to do to help with the imposition of martial law, he ended up calling with quite a degree of desperation for it. The Soviet Union turned him down. Of course, martial law succeeded. That's the part of it he leaves out. So the nuance that's there, though, tends to get lost in popular memory discussions of this. And there are those who either take a very white view, that is a very positive view of Jaruzelski, or again the very dark view of him. The kind of nuance that historiography shows gets lost. Similarly with Walesa, there has been a great deal of controversy going back to the 1990s, but particularly since the advent of the Kaczynski government, Jaroslaw Kaczynski's government in 2005, when Lech Kaczynski was elected president, then Yaroslav was elected prime minister. Lech Kaczynski had been a close aide of Lech Walesa, of Lech Walesa back at the time that Walesa was president in the early years of the Walesa presidency. Subsequently, they had a bitter falling out, and what that has meant is that there has been an effort that Kaczynski, as president, endorsed and encouraged, and this is where the manipulation of the IPN that Tim was mentioning before. I would actually attribute this more to individuals than to the nature of that institute per se, although I do think the nature of the institute poses problems. Up until that time, I would say the institute had been quite a nonpartisan organization. But as a result, there was an effort made to discredit Walesa, and again, there is incriminating evidence against him that he was an informant of some sort for the security service in Poland in the 1970s, from 1970 to 1976. The evidence also shows that he probably did not provide any information that was of significance, so that for the most part was quite innocuous. But Walesa has denied that entirely, and as a result, there has become a highly polarized debate about his role. There have been lengthy books produced by researchers affiliated with the IPN that have tried to show that, in fact, he was an informant. And what the problem with those books is not, or at least the one book that was produced by Tsenskiewicz and Gontarczyk, is not so much the evidence they amass, but such a one-sided assessment of Walesa. It presents that as the only thing about him worth considering, rather than the role he played in 1980-81, and even more the courageous role that he played in 1982 when the security service were putting a lot of pressure on him to try to turn against solidarity, and he refused. Let me look quickly at Ukraine. This came up. Here I would attribute, I think, again, following up very much on what Tim said earlier, here I would attribute more, though, responsibility for this to the Yushchenko government. Until and again, it's an illustration of how democratization can sometimes pose problems for popular memory. That until the Orange Revolution, history had always been a somewhat uneasy topic in Ukraine, but was never a particularly controversial thing. It didn't set people at bitter odds. Popular memory was somewhat murky in earlier years. After the Yushchenko came to power, suddenly, again, in part because his government proved not to be especially effective and there was extensive political infighting that went on, Yushchenko sought to mobilize what forces he could on his behalf, and as a result began making gestures that couldn't help but antagonize significant segments, not only of Ukraine's population, but also of neighboring countries, especially Poland. When you begin bestowing posthumous medals on people that whose past is very dubious, it is bound to antagonize people. Similarly, in pushing the issue of genocide, again, I fully agree with what Tim said. Under the very expansive definition of genocide used in the Genocide Convention, it's a definition I don't like, but that's what's there. And under that definition, there's no question, I think, that fits within it. But by pushing that issue in such a heavy-handed way, Yushchenko gave the impression, I think probably rightly, that he was using this more as a political weapon than as any effort to establish historical accuracy. Let me turn finally to look at Russia, and then I'll conclude. I'm going to talk about a few different things. From David touched very well on the question of the textbooks. I will touch briefly on the Anti-Falsification Commission in a second. In Russia, going back to Soviet Russia, there has been an effort to come to terms with Stalin for more than 50 years now. This dates back really to 1956 with Khrushchev's secret speech and the even stronger push for de-Stalinization that he did in October of 1961 at the 22nd Party Congress. In the secret speech, he emphasized the communist victims of Stalin. In October of 1961, he began to talk about some of the non-communists as well. This was still, though, a very highly selective effort to come to terms with Stalin for precisely the reason I mentioned at the beginning. Khrushchev was among those who were complicit in the Stalinist atrocities. So there was an effort made to shape popular memory of Stalin in a way that wouldn't expose the iniquities of those who were in power. After Khrushchev was ousted in October 1964, there was a long period in which this issue was submerged. And in fact, there was a partial rehabilitation of Stalin during the Brezhnev period. In the late 1980s, under Gorbachev, there was a renewed effort to look back at the Stalin years. This led to the publication of some quite interesting and revealing articles in the Soviet press and in Soviet journals. The level of popular interest in that period was probably greater than it has ever been, even after Khrushchev's secret speech, which of course became known widely in the Soviet Union, even though it was ostensibly secret, in part because it had become known in the West. But in the 1980s, when things were being published openly, it was very difficult to get a hold of many publications because so many people wanted to read them. One of the consequences of what has occurred since 1991 is that level of interest has almost disappeared. And so part of the reason that popular memory is so subject to manipulation now is there isn't that level of public interest, that politically influential elites can try to entrench their version of popular history more easily. Alexander Yakovlev, when I interviewed him in June 2001, Yakovlev was a senior aide to Gorbachev and then subsequently headed an official rehabilitation commission that rehabilitated people who had been repressed under Stalin. He said, and I quote from him, "Reading all these documents about horrible crimes and atrocities and bloodshed and suffering frightens me. It frightens me that people in this country could have behaved that way. But what frightens me even more is the fact that the large majority of people in Russia are completely indifferent to this information." The point he was making, in other words, is not that the problem is not a lack of information, it's a lack of sufficient commitment on the part of both the public, but particularly key elites. And David has already touched on the influence of the Putin years on popular memory. Let me just say, with regard to the Anti-Falsification Commission, the name of it itself, I think, is interesting. If you, again, think about the way I've talked about popular memory, that it's a political competition to entrench a particular version of history. That commission is to counter falsifications that are detrimental to Russia's interest. So presumably, the corollary of that is that falsifications are beneficial to Russia's interests, that they're welcome. So let me conclude then. If you think about the post-communist period, it's been brief by historical standards. Established democracies, I just got told I have -1 minute. Established democracies have had a great deal of difficulty coming to terms with history, even after the passage of a century. It's still very difficult in the United States for popular memory to come fully to terms with the abomination of slavery. It's not surprising that in post-communist countries that this would be such a difficult issue, particularly because there are still people around who have a real interest in defining the way this issue is looked on. At the same time, though, and here's where I'll end, is to say that to the extent that popular memory does diverge from what historiography is, that is, if it leaves out some of the most unsavory and unpleasant aspects of a country's past and doesn't make even the slightest effort to come to terms with them, then I think that is of great danger for any effort at democratization. And if you look at the countries that have made the most progress, you'll find that by and large, they are the ones that have advanced further in democratization. The ones that have done the least tend to be the most authoritarian. Thank you.
Thank you. Jan Werner Müller.
Thank you. I think it's fair to say that 15 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, maybe even 6 years ago, the German approach of coming to terms with the past, both with the Nazi past and the East German past, difficult and different as these pasts are, was almost globally considered a success. When South Africa transitioned to democracy, human rights activists, lawyers, and politicians would flock to Berlin to learn lessons about how the Germans had done it. Even today, the Chinese government occasionally admonishes the Japanese that they should follow the German model. Eventually, as many of you will know, this gave rise within Germany to a particular kind of pride in what variously is called Vergangenheitsbewältigung or Aufarbeitung, what some people saw as a peculiar sort of anti-nationalist nationalism, something that, to be sure, was eventually picked up and gently mocked by outside observers. 10 years ago, Timothy Garton-Ash spoke of Deutsche Industrienormen, German industrial norms, in coming to terms with the past, a kind of international standard of how these things were supposed to be done. Not anymore, it seems, at least if you listen to critics, a rising number of critics within Germany itself. Critics who are alleging that both processes of coming to terms with the past have been failures, though for very, very different reasons. In the case of coming to terms with the Nazi past and the Holocaust, the claim is that there has been a kind of, if you like, third-order failure. The failure has not been, at least according to these critics, at the level of doing justice to the victims. This is not about reparations, let's say. It's also not about a second-order failure in the sense of having the wrong content of remembrance. This is not about relativizing the Holocaust, making the wrong kinds of comparisons, none of that stuff even. It's at a third order, I would say, where these critics are claiming that nowadays the wrong kinds of mentalities, the wrong kinds of emotions have become attached to remembrance. And I explain in a second what exactly that is supposed to mean. In the case of dealing with the East German past, however, the claim by the critics is that the failure has been at all three levels. Lack of justice in treating the victims, the wrong kind of content for remembrance, and then finally also the wrong kind of emotions attached to how people think and above all feel about the GDR. Let me again try to explain that a little bit more in detail later on. What do these critics are saying is wrong with how the Holocaust and the Nazi past are commemorated in Germany today? Well, these critics are essentially saying that Germans have become all too comfortable with remembrance. That remembrance has become almost a kind of feel-good activity for many of the people engaging in it. If one looks at this claim more closely, it basically breaks down into two kinds of misappropriations or if you prefer, instrumentalizations of the victims of the Holocaust. A banal version and then a more complicated, more invidious version. The banal version is simply that remembrance has become, to put it bluntly, a form of entertainment. That all the sites of memory that you all know, the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, the Topography of Terror, the Jewish Museum, etc., have basically become tourist attractions. Some of you may remember Gerhard Schröder's famous demand when he talked about what kind of Holocaust memorial he would like to see, when he famously or infamously said he would like to see one which one enjoys visiting, wo man gerne hingeht. You also might remember that in 2005, when the memorial designed by Peter Eisenman was finally opened, there was some concern of what, let's say, unruly teenagers or kids would do in the vast field next to the Brandenburg Gate, whether they would misbehave in certain ways. And in a somewhat typical German way, a Besucherordnung, an order for visitors, was immediately released, telling people this is how you can or cannot behave within this vast, what after all is a sculpture into which one can literally walk. Something has happened recently which is much, much worse than what people ever thought could happen. Those of you, and there might not be many, who ever take the European low-cost airline EasyJet might have picked up one of their in-flight magazines recently, which featured a fashion shot in the Holocaust Memorial, a scantily clad model pictured in the Holocaust Memorial, and then also a sort of GQ-type man with fashionable clothes, also within the Holocaust Memorial. A nice background to a fashion shot. That in-flight magazine was immediately grounded when somebody pointed this out, but it very much reinforces the sense that there has been a kind of banal appropriation of memory. But as I said, that in a sense is to some degree banal. It's hard to see how to avoid that kind of appropriation. The other appropriation, or rather misappropriation, has been more invidious. Many of you will remember the famous 1985 speech by Richard von Weizsäcker, a landmark speech, when the then president said, quoting what he called in ancient Jewish wisdom, that the secret of redemption is memory. Not just reconciliation, redemption. And the recent critics are charging that many Germans now really take this literally. That they say, well, as long as we remember, or as long as we go through the routines of remembrance, we are indeed redeemed. Which, by the way, also seems to imply a very curious superimposition of a Christian notion of redemption onto something that which really ultimately might have a very different logic. But even leaving that aside, critics are charging, especially those arguing from a, roughly speaking, more psychoanalytical perspective, are arguing that in a very, very strange way, many Germans now are engaged in a sort of counter-identification with the victims, that national unity is created or maybe restored through this exclusive identification with the victims, which very conveniently then also cuts all actual links through the generations with the perpetrators. Now, what to make of this? One thing, of course, you could very easily say is that this is really a bit of a luxury problem. Only against the background of a highly developed, a highly sophisticated memory culture can you possibly engage in these very subtle, or if you permit the term, very dialectical sort of reflections on how memory can go wrong. But that's maybe a bit of a cheap shot. More importantly, it seems to me, the problem is that it's very hard to see what the alternative is, or more precisely, that the proposed alternative that many of these critics want to put forward isn't really one that can properly be institutionalized or cultivated in the way that at least state-led forms of remembrance can be. These critics are often saying that what should really happen is what, in the somewhat jargonistic language of the memory industry, is called commemoration through communication. The thought there is that the real way to keep the past alive, the real way to make people, in a sense, feel bad about it, to make people feel agonized about it, is through continuous debate. Even quite harsh, personal, problematic debates or disputes or arguments. These people often point out that what really constitutes the German success of coming to terms with the past is the string of major historical controversies. The historians' dispute of the 80s, the Walser-Bubis debate of the 90s, you can think of other examples. That is the real monument to the past. The real monument is speech. The real monument is not in stone, and as long as we keep talking in the right way, arguing in the right way, then the past will be alive in the right way. I don't disagree with that fundamental insight, but the obvious problem is that such controversies cannot be decreed. The obvious problem is that these things might happen contingently, that certain intellectuals who have sufficient clout and influence might feel that one should be triggered at a certain point, but it's not something that in any way can be officially, or let alone should be, officially imposed. Even beyond that, and this is an even more fundamental point, if these critics are ultimately after certain emotional states, if they ultimately are saying memory has to hurt in a particular kind of way, they might well be right. But it's not something we can ever ascertain. It can be faked in all kinds of ways. We might all think of politicians who we think of as being particularly good at that sort of faking. It's simply not something, again, that one can officially demand in the way that one can officially demand a historical commission, a monument, etc., etc. What about the East German past? The charge here, as I said, is at multiple levels, but it basically boils down to the idea that by now the image of the East German dictatorship has become very, very soft. That it's much more goodbye Lenin than the lives of others. As Freier Clear, a former dissident, put it famously, they, the supporters of the former dictatorship, sit in the Bundestag, in the media, in schools, in manifold commissions of our democracy, and they are trying to change the past and the future. I ad-libbed these last two words, paraphrasing what she said. Who are they? Who are these people? Who are the agents of basically making the East German past look better than it might have been? Well, most important in the eyes of critics, of course, the left-wing party, Die Linke. There's a nice sort of symbolic irony to the fact that, as many of you will know, the Stasi archives moved eventually from their former location close to the Hotel Adlon in Berlin, a little bit further east, and now the Stasi archive basically faces the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. Two large buildings where you basically could almost see people looking at each other, fighting over the past or an interpretation of the past as they see what the other side is doing. The left-wing party and what is now usually called the Bildlerbehörde, after the current head of what used to be the Gauck authority. The critics also point to the fact that, in theory, just as theorists of democratization would wish, civil society is flourishing. But it's the wrong kind of civil society. It's all kinds of associations with high-sounding names. Vereine for the protection of human rights, Vereine for justice, etc., etc. But a lot of these, according to the critics, are basically fighting for things like getting proper pensions for members of the Stasi. There are people who will literally turn up at some of the sites of memory in East Germany and contradict what the official guides are saying about, let's say, the Hohenschönhausen prison, saying, I was there, I was guard in 1980 or whatever, it was all different, you're wrong. In other words, agents of memory who are very, very actively contesting the image of the East German past. According to the critics, this has already given rise to a shocking level of ignorance among the next generation. There was a very controversial survey a couple of years ago which found a shockingly high number of pupils who had very peculiar ideas about the past, or, put differently, knew nothing at all. A high percentage of people thought that the West had erected the wall. A lot of people thought that Willy Brandt was an East German politician. Others thought that the Stasi was a secret service like any other. And a very, very high percentage of people thought that the environment had done much better under socialism. As I said, that survey was controversial for various methodological reasons, but it sent a signal that somehow the transmission of knowledge, not even of particular kinds of memory or commemoration, but simply of knowledge, was not working out the right way for the next generations. Now, what to make of these criticisms? 3 brief points. It seems to me that some of the failures in terms of justice, in terms of reparations, in terms of symbolic recognition of victims, etc., that some of the failures are undoubtedly the case. They're not made up by the critics, but to some degree they were structurally inevitable. Yes, justice was done unevenly, but that's partly the nature of German federalism. That's partly the nature of having a lot of decentralization, so that different state governments did do things differently. Yes, it's true, some of the measures of justice were effectively scaled back or taken back eventually, but that's the nature of having the rule of law or a very strong constitutional court. Many of you will remember the famous sentence by Bärbel Bohley, "We wanted justice and we got the rule of law." That might have been true in another sense. Not only was rule of law a sort of second best to justice, but the rule of law eventually also came with all kinds of decisions about pensions, for instance, for Stasi members, and other issues, which many people were maybe rightly unhappy with. But again, that's the nature of the rule of law. Secondly, second point is that in many ways the whole debate about dealing with the East German past has been distorted by people engaging in the wrong kinds of comparisons. I couldn't agree more with Tim Snyder about the fact that a lot of these general debates about comparisons have been characterized by profoundly illogical basic assumptions, wrong taboos, etc., etc. But in the German case, it seems to me it's clear that many times critics have reached for a comparison between how the East German dictatorship was dealt with and the Nazi past that simply isn't very helpful. It's not about erecting a taboo and saying these things must never be compared. It's simply a very inward-looking and provincial way of looking at the issue, a kind of methodological nationalism, when it seems to me at least the much more appropriate comparison would have been, should have been, with other post-communist countries. Yes, of course, I know, structurally the situations were very different. Not many other countries were absorbed into the richest country in Europe. Not many other countries could throw money around at Aufarbeitung and having lots of nice museums and huge archives, etc., etc. Nevertheless, I'm struck by the fact how those comparisons almost never appear. They never appear in the popular books, which are saying that the Stasi is back and that basically the Linke will take over. But even in the more serious academic literature, these comparisons are surprisingly rare. Last point on this, if I may, again a more structural one. It seems to me that when people make judgments as to whether the process of coming to terms with the East German past has been a success or not, they very often, consciously or unconsciously, have basically conflicting or fundamentally incompatible goals in mind. What I mean in particular is this. Very often people say, well, if we really want to say that this whole process has been a success, we have to have achieved what in a rather Orwellian turn of phrase is usually called inner unity, innere Einheit. All Germans ideally have the same image of the past, what is then often called ein gemeinsames Geschichtsbild. Now make of that what you wish, but it profoundly conflicts with the other intuition, which I mentioned earlier and which is so present among many German observers of these debates, namely commemoration through communication. You can't at the same time say We ultimately, ideally, would like an entirely harmonious image of the past, and we believe that the only way to keep the past alive at the same time is by constantly having controversies around it, and ideally having, even personal, vindictive, etc., debates and disputes in the public sphere. These things obviously don't quite go together. Again, you might say a rather obvious point, but one that I've rarely seen made in the -5? No. Anyway, let me conclude very briefly. I obviously want to suggest to you that recent criticisms, while they have a point in certain regards, are vastly overblown. What I also want to suggest, without in any way appealing to old cliches about Germany, is that in certain ways there's been a typical, I've said it anyway, a typical way of moving from one extreme to the other. From a certain kind of, if you permit the term, memory triumphalism to a very tortured self-criticism, which within the existing discourse makes a certain amount of sense, but in the global picture seems vastly overblown. Thank you.
Bogdan Jakob.
Hello. So we moved from Germany to Romania, but I think in my paper I'll touch upon some of the issues that Jan already talked about. So the title of my paper is Romanian Communist Past and the Entrapment of Polemics. I'll first start with preliminary remarks, and then I'll try to formulate the puzzle of my paper. In September this year, the Institute for the Investigation of Communist Crimes in the Memory of the Romanian Exile published a poll on the opinions and attitudes of the Romanian population about the communist past. Among many of the rather contradictory results, the poll shows how 78% of the respondents answered no at the question, did you personally or a member of your family suffer because of the communist regime? At the same time, 47% considered that the regime was criminal, 42% that it was illegitimate, and 50% admit that under the communist regime there was repression. What I need to specify here is that the last three numbers that I mentioned in reference to the statistical proportion for each question, they represented a marginal majority. We need to couple these results with the December 2006 condemnation by the Romanian president on the basis of a report drafted by an international commission. Cristian Vasile talked extensively about it. The communist regime was condemned criminal and was condemned as criminal and illegitimate. ICCMR is the main institution that by mandate is trying to implement the recommendations of the president's condemnation speech. So the statistics above mentioned cannot be compared with previous similar results. Usually polls on the communist past are focused mainly on questions such as was it better or worse before 1989, or would have Ceausescu become president if he were alive today. So in the absence of relevant data that would measure the evolution of public opinion in the past 4 years along the lines of the conclusion of the condemnation speech, one cannot evaluate fully the impact of the act of condemnation itself. However, the poll is relevant on a different level. Its importance lies in the possibility to analyze the conceptual chain that plays the role of signifier in reference to the regime, that is, repression, criminality, illegitimacy, suffering. If we wish to establish this connection on the basis of the mentioned statistics, it does not appear to function. Indeed, the first three elements seem to have a more general quality, while the fourth, personal, subjective one. Despite the marginally majoritarian acceptance of the first three as descriptive labels of the communist experience in Romania, there is highly decreased identification with individual, collective, or even family suffering for the historical period in question. Here comes my puzzle. Why do increasingly widespread negative perceptions of the communist regime in Romania do not overlap with an affirmation of individual trauma? And here trauma is understood in a larger sense, both as affliction and responsibility. To take my question even further, is there something in the discourse about the communist past at the level of public opinion that prevents or does not lead to the connection between communism as historical experience based on perceptions about institutions, events, personalities, and communism as lived experience? My answer will focus on two types of interconnected explanations. On the one hand, in a highly charged post-December 2006 environment, in some areas of the Romanian public opinion, communism has ceased having value as a subject in itself. And these sectors of the public opinion, they're not particularly relevant in, let's say, academic debate, but they still belong to the center of Romanian public sphere, and they're highly visible and being very active in most read or most watched elements of mass media. At the same time, my analysis of these criticisms does not mean in any way that the report and the condemnation of the communist regime were not perceived positively by the population. Upon its publication, the report has been widely appreciated. Only later, as the political environment in Romania got more polarized, did the number of those who publicly outright rejected it or strongly attacked it increased. So to return to my first direction of explanation, communism began starting to serve as a pretext to disparage persons, institutions, opinions in the present. In other words, talking about communism gave way to constructing a strawman type of putatively state-engineered, presidentially supported anti-communism. According to this point of view, the condemnation speech became just a self-interested act rather than a crucial phase in the process of dealing with the communist past in Romania. Within these sectors of the public opinion, the publication of the Commission's report basically officialized a new state ideology, anti-communism. On the other hand, and this is the second track of explanation for my puzzle, a related development is the scarcity of former problematization in the public sphere along the direction signaled by the report. The latter document, being a collective work that encompasses multiple approaches on specific issues related to the analysis of the communist regime, it does offer significant directions on debate on issues as the role of ideology, legitimacy, the dyad victim-perpetrator, responsibility and guilt, etc. Even if these issues were raised, they merely serve the purpose of constructing delegitimizing narratives about the actors that brought them into public conversation, and many times these actors were members of the Commission. So first I'll construct a conceptual map of the report in order then to see how it translated into public debate. According to the report, the communist phenomenon in Romania was an avatar of the totalitarian experience, which manifested itself as a dictatorship of a Stalinist type from beginning to the end. While the party in power operated during the period of the consolidation of its rule, a nationalization of structures and ideology. The regime is defined as national Stalinist, for it is considered to sum up both the phenomenon of indigenization of Marxism and its inscription within the overall history of communism, that is, a local project of building socialism in one country. Because of the mandate of the Commission focused on institutions, methods of dictatorial rule, political personalities, and ideology, the report turned its attention to party, secret police, and propaganda as fundamental levers of domination across the whole institutional and personal spectrum of the party state. Therefore, the formula totalitarian state is used for emphasizing the radical revolutionary transformism exercised over society by means of instrumentalizing the tenets of Marxist-Leninism. And the phrase dictatorial state defines the monopoly of state power by the Romanian Communist Party. Legitimacy is dealt on 4 levels: as primitive accumulation of legitimacy, the breakthrough period, consolidation and inclusion through infrastructural development and national turn, social, political, and symbolic project of founding a novel identity for communism, and 4th, legitimacy of suspension of disbelief or as compensatory legitimacy. On the other hand, the analysis of the status and meaning of the victim are rather clustered. First, there is a general conception of victimhood. Following Monville, the premise of this concept, my reading of it, the premise of this concept is, quote, a history of violent traumatic aggression and loss, a belief in this history's unjust nature, and a fear of its repetition. Therefore, the general explanation of criminality of the communist regime in the report is based upon constructing a case for imprescriptibility of crimes against humanity undergone by the regime as a nexus of individual institutions and methods. There are overlapping ways of talking about victims in the report. like breaking with their objectivization by laying bare and deconstructing the penal categories that order communist practices of plucking and landscaping the human garden in Romania. Second, the national community is presented as a victim with a secret guilt by stressing ambivalence of suffering on the long term. And then you have the hero script, along with accepting and emphasizing negotiated aspect of the communist experience. The narrative about victims is both reparational in the sense of naming those who oppose the regime, but also retributive in the sense of constructing exemplary portraits of embodiments of party-state criminality. So the cluster narrative about victims under communist regime generates a specific positioning of state versus society that comes close, in my opinion, to the resistance paradigm. That is, like to quote Nicolas Werth, a refractory society shaped the political practices of Stalinism, as I think applies in Romania as well. The final report identifies the following modes of struggle against power: active resistance, SOPN resistance, insubordination and deviancy, and autonomous forms of popular opinion. Regarding the presentation of the perpetrators, the final report identified 4 types: those guilty for the tens of thousands of deaths, those guilty for the annihilation of dissidents and attacks against the opposition in exile, those guilty for the indoctrination of population, mainly propaganda and censorship apparatus, and those guilty for the abuses and deaths during 1989 in its immediate aftermath through the employment of strategic use of anarchy as a tool of political violence. Now I'm moving to the criticism and to the conceptual aftermath of the report. I identified the first element of criticism that I identify is rejection. Some analysts altogether reject the report, despite the fact that it basically brought together maybe the most important trends in the analysis of Romanian communism within the academic community. Others argued that the narrative about Romanian communism, as it appears in the report, is, and I quote here, the greatest lie within the public space is the great lie of communist propaganda. In this context, the report was simply, and I quote the same author, a pile of irrelevant historical writing that does not explain what communism really was. The fundamental problem with this position is that despite its total denial of the report, it does not propose an alternative interpretation. The counterpart is only implicit as a sort of mirage, but only reference to it automatically legitimizes criticism. The dismissal of the report is not only, let's say, conceptual, but also at the level of personnel, as several members of the Commission, starting with its president, are considered altogether unqualified to lead a group of scholars in the operation of writing about communism. Of course, the ultimate justification is, again, they know better. The second type of criticism, analytical contestation. This section of criticism attempted to pick on some of the issues dealt with by the various chapters of the report and provide alternative interpretations. Unfortunately, this area of the post-December 2006 debate increasingly became evanescent as the focus of discussion shifted from the past to the present. The most important issue here was the rebuff of the report's approach that the regime was continuously Stalinist on the one Stalinist one, and that its national turn was a form of radicalization rather than de-radicalization and liberalization. The alternative explanation consists in talking about two communism in Romania, alien terroristic one versus patriotic constructive one. Through this narrative, its advocates attempt to salvage from the past the memory of certain years that can impact on the legacy of specific personalities, political personalities from the communist past. Or they try to project an oldies but goldies image of social life under communism. Another group of reactions focused on the perceived incongruence between the formula of totalitarian system and problem of the latter's legitimacy and reproduction. However, none of these critics proposed, at least publicly, an alternative framework of interpretation. None of the discussions implied by the analysis of this loaded term from the Anglo-Saxon academia, or even the most recent rereadings like Geyer and Fitzpatrick book, none of these found their way into the public debate in Romania. Moreover, I believe, for example, that complementary characterizations of concepts such as victim, perpetrator, resistance, party domination from the report do point to a novel interpretation of communist experience in Romania as a form of, let's say, participatory totalitarianism. That is, a synthesis between, and I'm here playing with some Foucaultian terms, the study of the grand strategies of the state and that of the tactics of the little habitat. Of course, I'm developing here a point that I found in an article by Astrid Gahadin. An additional criticism against the report was related to a putative inflationist usage of the term genocide. However, what has been missed by the representatives of this position is that, on the one hand, the term genocide appears only in the section written by the Association of Former Political Prisoners. On the other, as I mentioned earlier, the report labels the regime's criminality in relation to crimes against humanity and massive violations of human rights, and not genocide. One crucial point made by the report, the connection between social, cultural, economic transformation and the politics of coercion, excision, and extermination has not been touched upon by any of the critics of either the report's definition of criminality or its usage of the concept of totalitarianism. A third category of criticism is non-objectivity, the fact that the Commission was created by presidential decision, that its conclusions and recommendations were adopted by a state authority and have the possibility of becoming state policies in education, culture, judicial system, negates, according to the critics, the scientific value of the report itself. Many of the variations upon this type of criticism tend to conveniently forget or ignore the established practice of state commissions entrusted with dealing with the past. With very few exceptions, the entire debate in the past 4 years has largely overlooked the example of other cases such as Germany, Eastern European countries, South Africa, Latin America. This happened despite repeated references made by members of the Commission to these cases. A fourth and last category of criticism is, and this is the large one that basically at this point kind of brings the previous three together, anti-communism, a new ideology, ? This group of critics of the report and the Commission, despite their indictments against initiative to condemn the communist regime, to construct a public discourse about responsibility in reference to the past, and despite their opposition against any exercise of public use of history, this does not appear to the entire, to all of them, but to only a section of it. So these critics, they fail to provide a proper characterization of their subject of attack. Instead of deconstructing the conceptual, methodological, or thematic contents of the report, or instead of analyzing the theoretical complex that lies at the foundation of the process of working through the communist past, this group, though not in a unitary one, prefers to construct an abstract entity, these anti-communists who are state-sponsored. So this abstract entity is perceived as either laboring over a narrative to sustain that powers that be, for example, President Băsescu, or to produce false consciousness by indoctrinating the public opinion with its version of the past that represses alternative regimes of memory or interpretations of communist experience. For many of these critics, the report is more of a totem rather than an analysis upon which further discussions about an understanding of the past would ensue. A recent intervention excellently exemplifies this perception. The author argues that the publication of the report was the moment of transition from moral and historical condemnation to memorialization and indoctrination. Once the verdict was given, any later historical research that wishes to be validated domestically must necessarily reproduce this verdict. Leaving aside the fanciful presupposition that the members of the Commission control the academic field and that they would repress scholarship in a different key than that of the report, what this type of approach seems to state, in my opinion, is the inconsistency of a burdened past that needs to be overcome. This criticism is not interested in the justification about the regime's criminality based on crimes against humanity of massive violations of human rights, or is not interested in regime's illegitimacy based on the absence of democratic accountability and pluralism. These people simply reject the validity of relevance of the process of working through the communist past. Interestingly enough, some of these critics are also those who have introduced pop communism and cool nostalgia in the Romanian public sphere. A sense of loss does seem to exist, but not as trauma, responsibility, or guilt, but as a loss of utopia, combined with sometimes self-centered, masculating projections of youth. Another fundamental premise for this sector of criticism is, simply put, yes, the regime should be condemned. Yes, we need to carry on with dealing with the past. But among the actors involved in this process, certain individuals who are currently associated with the process should not figure at all. The sobering observation that can be derived from this is that if at the beginning of the Commission's activity this standpoint belonged to the fringes of the Romanian public sphere, presently it lies at the core of the Kulturkampf generated by the forcing of the past into the present. The core idea here is that the process of dealing with the past is not understood as a democratic practice. It is truthful or real only if practiced by certain individuals and only if it's backed by certain politicians. In this sense, a national problem becomes a sectarian prerogative. The analysis of the communist regime is also transformed into an instrument of cultural hysteria, as certain individuals, many a times members of the Commission, are simply painted as erroneous or untruthful, regardless of the content of their positions and opinions. Now I'm going to conclude. It would be naive to expect a full-fledged thematic and conceptual sophistication starting from the report within the public sphere. The problem, however, lies in the fact that whole sections of the public opinion stop talking about responsibility, guilt, trauma, legitimacy, domination, crimes, remembrance, resistance, co-option, etc. If at the beginning some debates appeared on totalitarianism, genocide, national communism, gradually they died down, being replaced by wholesale arguments that either reject altogether the relevance of dealing with the communist past or create taxonomies of who should carry the process further and what elements of it are truly important. Despite the fact that from many points of view the Commission's report depatrimonialized historical analysis of Romanian communism through de-ideologization, demythologization and reprofessionalization, to take a point made by Cristina and Dragoș Petrescu, and denormalize the communist past, some individuals, newspapers, weeklies, televisions have seemingly decided that this collective effort could not be a starting point for further discussion and debate. It is no surprise, therefore, to find out that from polls that conceptions such as suffering have a rather limited and skewed understanding within the population. If one does not talk of complex determinants of suffering under the communist regime, but prefers to invent entities that supposedly either hide the truth about suffering or overinflate it for the sake of putative symbolic profit, then indeed the whole point of working through the past is missed. To return to my initial puzzle, one can notice the sidetracking of the process of dealing with the past. I mean by this the phenomenon in which introspective debates about crucial problems related to a better understanding of the past, to an expansion of knowledge on the basis of public use of history, have been gradually replaced or eclipsed in some sectors of the public opinion, particularly in the mass media, by an instrumentalist obsession, according to which any narrative about the past that claims to attempt a clarification by subject, theme, policy, or concept only serves to legitimize the powers that be in present Romania, or to repress alternative but undefined and unreconstructed interpretations. To phrase my conclusion in a simpler form, Aufarbeitung as a consequence of the 2006 Commission report and condemnation speech in Romania is suffering from a case of arrested development. Segments of the public opinion gave up on dealing with the past in order to keep talking about it only for settling accounts in the present. The past as a pedagogical and knowledge resource for democratic stabilization has no value in itself. It is merely a pun for the present. This is what I consider the entrapment of polemics.
Thank you. So the higher authorities, which I have to obey, have allowed us to extend the time for this session. And I guess I'm also obey them in that they requested that I start the discussion by making some comments. So I will make those comments. And why should I get up? I'll make them sitting down. It seems to me a number of people have already commented about the great virtue of this conference being its broad comparative perspective. So I would certainly like to reinforce that by making my comments rely on that, inspired by these papers, inspired also by papers yesterday. What I want to focus on is something that we might say would complement the analysis of politics of memory, and talk about what we might call the moral and institutional code of memory. If you like to give it a title, Beyond the German Industrienormen, question mark, or maybe South African Industrienormen. So, what can we, is there anything that we can learn, and I would like the panelists to answer that beyond your question as well. Is there anything that we can learn from all these experiences about the following kinds of question? What should we remember? How should we remember? When should we remember, and why? So, to get this kind of discussion going, let me put out a number of things that, as I say, was inspired by the various papers, both in this panel and actually yesterday. So, point number one, what does commitment to truth mean beyond straight facts, individual events, numbers? Very much appreciate how important precise numbers are, but commitment to truth seems more serious. What is it? What does commitment to balance mean? What should it really mean? And what are its limits? Let me give two examples of limits that are very much taken from Mark Kramer's paper, that is inspired by. He doesn't do this, but inspired by. I believe balanced memory is very important. On the other hand, I don't detect any inclination anywhere, certainly not in me, to insist on a balanced memory of Hitler. There was this to be sure, but no, we don't have a balanced memory. We ought not to have a balanced memory. Why? I think, I may be wrong, but I think it's because we think memory is also an instrument of deserved punishment. And Hitler does not deserve a balanced memory. But you know, if it's a matter of punishment, there should be due process. There is no due process in this area. A case, the Hitler case is in Mark Kramer's paper, at least this aspect of Wałęsa was also in his presentation. Is there a role for memory as deserved reward? Is it justifiable to forget certain things as a justifiable reward for great accomplishments elsewhere? That may be the case of Wałęsa. So that was point number two, balance and its limits. Point number three, what does patriotic memory require? Should we have patriotic memory? But what does it require? Let me remind you of a quotation from a speech by French President Chirac that Annette Vivorca invoked yesterday in a speech that urged France to face the truth about Vichy, but a speech in which he says, France, home of the Enlightenment and human rights. So in urging facing of unpleasant facts, he also invokes a memory of which France can be justifiably proud. So a patriotic form of commemoration. The subject of patriotic memory came up in discussion of Cuba. I'm tempted to call it nation building because the idea of nation building has been stolen by people who build states. I think it should be stolen back. I'm not sure stealing from someone who's stolen is stealing, but anyway. So this nation building kind of memory mentioned by Jan Werner Müller in context of uniting divided Germany, at least that idea. But I think nation building can also be done by reformulating the national tradition in a way that makes it more admirable. And that is not just invoking the great tradition of the Enlightenment and human rights in France, it is making one's nation more admirable by what? question. A fourth point, I have only 5. A fourth point, what is the relationship of what we should remember to democratic stability? A number of people have made the claim that a certain kind of remembering is crucial or at least important or at least contributes to democratic stability. Actually, on that front, I have a very crude empirical question. What is the evidence? But the larger question is, how, what kind of remembering contributes to democratic stability? Finally, how to remember. Let me just throw out two aspects of this. Concepts and institutions. Concepts, a number of them came up as central concepts in sort of larger efforts to remember totalitarianism, genocide. And then, of course, institutions. We've had a number of those discussions in the papers, ranging from Poland that was discussed some in the background, Romania discussed in the foreground, and of course that wonderful presidential commission in Russia. So I have an idea of a number of ideas translating into Germany, but one is presidential commission to start disturbing debates. Should there be such a presidential commission in light of the discussion of Germany by Jan Verman Müller? All right, so concepts and institutions. Anyway, what should we remember? How should we remember, and why? Now we have we're opening it up again to anybody who would like to speak. The microphones are in the side aisles. Please identify yourself for the benefit of all of us. And why don't we take a number of questions in a row and then give the panelists a chance to respond. Yeah.
Thanks. Tim Snyder, Yale University. I had a question to Jan Werner Müller, although reflections from others would be welcome too. I'm wondering, Jan, how, in a more general normative way, you are now thinking about our presumption that to commemorate means to identify with the victim. That's something that we generally take for granted to the extent that it seems almost synonymous. In your paper, there was the specific historical critique of Germans that identification with victims allows for a break with real generational continuity. But I wonder, with perpetrators in the generations before, I wonder, though, how you see this question in general. To what extent is it right to identify only with victims? Might there be some moral purchase to be gained elsewhere?
Right there.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on this comparative dimension. Charles Villivicencio here. I'm from South Africa. I wanted to pick up on this comparative dimension, and I also wanted to really engage Jan Werner Müller on his presentation. And, let me say, I found it one of the more pertinent comments on memorialization and memory that I've been subjected to over many years. I mean, this is a very complex thing to talk about. And as you were speaking about these concerns, you could have been speaking about South Africa. You could have been speaking about many Latin American countries grappling with this notion of memorialization and how to deal with it. I was fascinated by your comment on somebody concerning the Holocaust Memorial, I think it was, in Berlin, saying, well, we want something to enjoy. I was in conversation with colleagues in Mozambique, where I work quite extensively, and their approach to memorialization was silence, reconciliation through silence. There was no attempt, no institutionalized attempt to do anything. Trials, truth commissions, or anything else. And I was in conversation with this guy, and this was in Maputo, in an urban area rather than the rural area where different things are happening. And I said to him, well, how do you deal with the past? How do you deal with the civil war that raged in Mozambique? And he shrugged his shoulders and he said, well, we go to the pub and we have a beer with one another. And yes, sometimes we laugh about it. Something to enjoy. My question to you, Jan Werner, is how does one create a notion of memorialization that is indeed redemptive, not only at the time, because I think the Truth Commission in South Africa was almost redemptive at the time, but today, you know, most South Africans feel actually quite good about the fact that we acknowledged what happened. It's quite pleasant. How does one create a memory of redemption that is sustainable? Just that.
In the back.
Eric Langenbacher from Georgetown University. My question is also for Jan Werner Müller. I really very much enjoyed your overview of the last 10 years of commemoration in Germany. But it struck me that you overlooked one of the biggest memory dynamics over the last 8-10 years, which is the return of the memory of German suffering. And so I'm just wondering how these kind of renewed discourses affect commemoration and memory discourses regarding the Holocaust and East Germany.
Jeffrey, on the condition that it's not for Jan Werner Müller.
Jeffrey Herr from the University of Maryland. The first and most important reason why this memory takes place is the not to be taken for granted contribution of revealing and repeating and examining the truth about what happened in the past. Because there's an enormous vested interest in each of these societies in seeing that the truth of these atrocities not come to the fore. People seem to, and this is, the Nuremberg trials are constantly taken for granted as if, oh, it was just so obvious. But before Nuremberg, that kind of thing didn't happen. My question to Mark Kramer about foreign policy and Germany. The German Foreign Ministry under Adenauer and then especially under Brandt, concluded that, especially under Brandt and Ostpolitik, that frank acknowledgement of the Nazi war on the Eastern Front was a precondition for West German diplomatic relations with the countries of Eastern Europe in the 1970s and 80s. In other words, there was a national interest, a practical power political national interest in speaking truthfully about the past and not being silent or certainly not lying about it, because the nature of the Nazi regime, as Tim reminded us this morning, was one that occupied many other countries. And so this is different from other countries that suppress their own citizens. But when you suppress the citizens of other countries and then you want to have relations with them later, there's a practical interest in speaking frankly. And Bogdan, seemed to me that what you were describing in the attacks on the Commission and the attacks on the character of the Commission and was the persistence of communism and the persistence of communist mentalities. That it's not necessary, and it's not necessary to pay attention to the evidence or the argument, but all you have to know is who has said what, and that's all you need to know. And once you know that, there's no need to pay attention to anything that anybody says regarding evidence. That's communist mentality.
Let me give the floor to the panelists, and if there's time, we'll come back for more questions. Why don't we go with David first and continue until Bogdan.
All right. Well, let me respond to the critique for just a moment on the issue of moral responsibility and the institutional role in commemoration. At least from the post-Soviet perspective, I think it can be summarized in the endorsement of a heterogeneous narrative that features debates. I endorse your idea of a commission to start tortured debates. Feedback. It's better history if we feature debates rather than a single official line, and it refutes the traditional Soviet reflex towards a singular official line. So I heartily endorse it.
Let me see on, is it possible to forget certain things? What should we remember? Let me quickly deal with this issue by saying, in terms of popular memory, it's not that we should forget certain things, but we can de-emphasize them. For example, the person I regard as the greatest U.S. president, Abraham Lincoln, had some views that we today would find repugnant, particularly about race. But that doesn't change the fact that in historical perspective, I think he should be remembered as a truly great president. And similarly with Lech Walesa. Walesa was a deeply flawed figure, there's no question. He was not a good president when he was president of Poland. He seems to have tampered with files dealing with his role with the security service. And the time that he did work for the security service itself is a strike against him. But I think in the larger perspective, he will stand as a positive figure in Polish history because of his role in 1980, 81, and throughout the 1980s. So it's not that we should forget those things, but it is, at least in popular memory, possible to de-emphasize them and making an assessment of the person in moral terms. Historians don't, again, historians inevitably judge things from a moral perspective as well, but that's not their primary task. But popular memory, it's a different matter. With regard to Jeff's question, and it does touch on, I'm actually, to pick up on what you said, I do specifically mention in here Willy Brandt's gesture in December 1970 when he went to Poland and knelt at the monument to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And that was, again, it was a gesture, and it was presented as being in West Germany's foreign policy interest. But still, it was a profoundly important thing. It did convey the sorrow and the unmitigated condemnation of what had occurred under the Nazi regime in a way that nothing that Adenauer did had. And so that, I do think that there is importance to gestures that can have very direct foreign policy interests, but part of it is to determine how sincere they appear to be. I know, for example, Bill Clinton, after having not intervened in Rwanda in 1994, later apologized for it, and it didn't have the same impact that Brandt's gesture did. It's not to say it wasn't sincere, but it didn't have that kind of vivid impact. Finally, let me say, with regard, because Karol brought it up, is with regard to Hitler, again, it brings out how it's important in making, from the perspective of both historiography, but also especially popular memory, assessments of regimes. You could write a history of Nazi Germany, especially in the 1930s, and just dwell on relatively positive things. If you were an Aryan German in Germany during that point and you weren't a communist, you by and large were living a lot better than you had been 10 years earlier. So, at least in material terms, you could write a history of Nazi Germany and emphasize that and come up with a relatively positive assessment of the Nazis. But again, that to me would be morally so abominable that I think it is perfectly acceptable in terms of popular memory to leave out, or at least to severely downplay, that aspect of Nazi Germany, and instead to dwell on the unsurpassed evil of the Holocaust and of other Nazi crimes.
Jan Werner, you have 30 seconds to answer the 7 questions that you were...
Well, let me first of all clarify that appearances to the contrary, I'm not entirely categorically against people ever feeling good, including about memory efforts they might have made in the past. It's okay with me. More seriously, let me try to take the questions together and link it back to, I think, what was a very important question from Karol, namely, what does commitment to truth mean in this context, beyond, let's say, establishing the facts, which is not to say that that's easy. It seems to me there's sort of two fantasies which keep recurring in debates about memory. One is the fantasy of the historian parachuting in and saying, wie ist eigentlich gewesen, and then we could be done with certain debates. The other fantasy, I think, is that if we only could achieve some kind of unmediated emotional identification with the victims, or wie ist eigentlich gewesen for them, that would make us better human beings, would make us sign up for the right human rights agenda, make us sign up for humanitarian intervention, and so on and so forth. I think the non-fantasy answer is that efforts of remembrance, in my view, ideally should be linked, on the one hand, to complex historiographical and especially conceptual debates. I think there's sometimes a kind of anti-academic prejudice that these more arcane conceptual debates don't really matter. What does it matter if 5 historians disagree about the term Unrechtsstaat when millions of people have seen the lives of others, and that's really how they've learned about the GDR? I don't think that's right. I think these framings are profoundly important. I think that if these debates get off on a wrong footing, some of these conceptual debates can be completely stalemated, which in my view is the case in the GDR, where people are sort of forced to choose between totalitarianism theory and everyday history with profound moral implications, as if there was nothing in between, or as if you couldn't even combine the two in certain interesting ways. But there's basically an entire moralization on the basis of these conceptual choices. I mean, I could say more about it, but many of you, I think, will know what I'm talking about. So these conceptual background debates are very important. And the other thing that it strikes me is important is a larger, if you like, normative or moral discourse. I think, actually, rather than what some of these critics I was referring to say being right, namely that, it was important that, in the historians' dispute, we really had a very personal clash between major intellectuals, and the temperature really rose, and taboos were broken or not broken or erected. I think what really mattered, to some degree, is that in a lot of what happened in terms of coming to terms with the Nazi past, there was a link to larger moral debates. The name Habermas is obvious in this context, but there were others, like Carlo Apel, who really said, well, does this experience tell us anything larger about moral philosophy? If so, how can debates on moral philosophy be related back to how we think about the past? I think that's another aspect which hasn't really been present at all in debates about the GDR. Again, I'm not saying comparing in the wrong way, saying they're automatically the same things as the Nazi past, but the absence of moral philosophers, when we're talking about very complex moral choices in terms of collaboration, everyday behavior, and so on, the absence of those kind of larger normative considerations has been rather striking, and maybe has made that debate less fruitful than the debate about the Nazi past. So specifically to Tim, I'm not against attempts to identify with victims, but I think they have to be mediated by these other elements: conceptual debates, moral debates. Again, I think it's a nice fantasy, but now conclusively disproven by historians that in the 1940s, people say, the Holocaust happened, we're all going to sign up for human rights now. The fact that it happened differently doesn't discredit human rights. But I think it's just too nice an idea that seeing suffering in and of itself will lead us to the right normative conclusions. It has to be mediated by the right kinds of debates, by the right kind of historical literature. And that, to some degree, again, is not something that can be imposed very easily, or there's no rule book of how to do this. But it's, to some degree, a matter of we know it when we see it. We know when debates go wrong. We can sometimes tell that the wrong conceptual background assumptions are in play, and that ideally debates would be diverted into other directions.
Thank you.
I will actually develop 2 points here, starting from Jan's argument and trying to return to the questions that you formulated at the beginning of your comments. So you said at one point, what does the commitment to truth mean? What does the meaning of balance mean? So in my opinion, truth and balance can be related in this type of questions to the third question that you posed, the problem of patriotic memory. And in the sense that commitment to truth and commitment to balance in dealing with the past actually can prevent the development of, in my opinion, of a patriotic memory in the sense of self-promotion, and rather to move it to what Jan was talking about in terms of a larger normative framework of interpretation of the past. And he actually extensively wrote on the concept of constitutional patriotism. And I think that from this point of view, if you want to go for a patriotic memory, I think that that's the only way to go. Otherwise, you turn back to the Siegfried nation that, what Robert C. Tucker called the Siegfried nation that overcomes history and just, flies through the future. And then to return to the point made by Professor Herf, I think that indeed, I don't know, yeah, it is very characteristic of communist mentality, this type of approach to debate, to discussion, to the public sphere. But I think that overall, what I would say that can be definitely noticed in Romania is a return of the authoritarian personality in the public sphere, and people who with great ease dismiss the importance of debates related to the communist past, the importance of dealing with the communist past, just because of various personal reasons or other individual motivations.
Thank you, panelists, for a terrific set of papers and I thought really profound discussion.